Well, that's one aspect of what's called reducing government, modifying government to be more precise. Another aspect of it is what's called devolution, moving governmental power from federal to the state level. And that has a kind of a rationale which you hear all over the place. For example, there was an op-ed a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times by John Cogan of Hoover Institute at Stanford, who pointed out what he called a philosophical issue that divides the Democrats and the Republicans. The philosophical issue is that the Democrats believe in big government and entitlement, and the Republicans believe in getting power down closer to the people, to the states, because they're kind of populist types. Well, it takes about maybe 3 seconds thought to realize that moving power down to the states in funding and so on is just moving it away from the people for a perfectly elementary reason. There's a hidden part of the system, of the power system, that you're not supposed to know about or think about, and that's private power.
Today, poems remain an important part of art and culture. We often talk about the knowledge about the literature in poem. Poetry is probably the oldest form of literature and probably predates the origin of writing itself. The oldest written manuscripts we have are poems, mostly epic poems telling the stories of ancient mythology. The English language in poems and poetries is difficult to understand, often giving readers a feeling of frustration and making it hard for readers to enjoy poetry. This is because poems use literary expressions. Poetry was once written according to fairly strict rules of meter and rhyme, and each culture had its own rules. Some poems incorporate rhyme schemes with 2 or more lines that end in like-sounding words. We should learn to simply enjoy it and to know more about literature knowledge.
A leader can define or clarify goals by issuing a memo or an executive order, an edict or a fatwa or a tweet, by passing a law, barking a command, or presenting an interesting idea in a meeting of colleagues. Leaders can mobilize people's energies in ways that range from subtle, quiet persuasion to the coercive threat or the use of deadly force. Sometimes a charismatic leader such as Martin Luther King Jr. can define goals and mobilize energies through rhetoric and the power of example. We can think of leadership as a spectrum in terms of both visibility and the power the leader wields. On one end of the spectrum, we have the most visible, authoritative leaders like the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or a dictator such as Hitler or Gaddafi. At the opposite end of the spectrum is casual, low-key leadership found in countless situations every day around the world, leadership that can make a significant difference to the individuals whose lives are touched by it. Over the centuries, the first kind, the out-in-front, authoritative leadership, has generally been exhibited by men. Some men in positions of great authority, including Nelson Mandela, have chosen a strategy of leading from behind. More often, however, top leaders have been quite visible in their exercise of power. Women, as well as some men, have provided casual, low-key leadership behind the scenes. But this pattern has been changing as more women have taken up opportunities for visible, authoritative leadership. I suppose it's the truism to point out that citizens need to be well informed. Maybe it's something we take for granted in our liberal Western democracies. But there will be plenty of societies, well, that is run counter to explicit government policy. Many areas of the world still suffer from the reverie of the deliberate missing information. Governments, especially the unelected ones, but also some elected ones, have denied the events that have ever taken place. They pretend that other events did take place. They would help spin what they cannot deny. Ensure they've used every trick of the book to pull the eyes of the world and in an attempt to cover up their mistakes.
Many of us like to start the day with a cup of coffee and perhaps end the day with a glass of wine or some other kind of alcoholic drink. But it turns out that these two substances, alcohol and caffeine, can have surprising impacts on our sleep. Let's start with caffeine. Caffeine is in a class of drugs that we call the psychoactive stimulants. And everyone knows that caffeine can make them more alert, it can wake them up. But there are at least two additional hidden features of caffeine that some people may not be aware of. The first is the duration of action of caffeine. Caffeine for the average adult will have what we call a half-life of about 5 to 6 hours. What that means is that after about 5 to 6 hours, 50% of that caffeine that you had is still circulating in your system. What that also means is that caffeine has a quarter life of about 10 to 12 hours. In other words, let's say that you have a cup of coffee at 2 p.m. in the evening. It could be that almost a quarter of that caffeine is still swirling around in your brain at midnight. And as a result, it can make it harder for an individual to fall asleep or even stay asleep soundly throughout the night. So that's the first feature of caffeine. The second issue with caffeine is that it can change the quality of your sleep.
We all know that saving is important and it's something that we should be doing, and yet overall, we're doing less and less of it. We know what we need to do. The question is, how do we do it? And that's what I'm here to teach you. Your savings behavior isn't a question of how smart you are or how much willpower you have. The amount we save depends on the environmental cues around us. Let me give you an example. We ran a study in which, in one group, we showed people their income on a monthly basis. In another group, we showed people their income on a weekly basis. And what we found was that people who saw their income on a weekly basis were able to budget better throughout the month. Now, it's important to know that we didn't change how much money people were receiving. We just changed the environment in which they understood their income. And environmental cues like this have an impact. So I'm not gonna share tricks with you that you already know. I'm not gonna tell you how to open up a savings account or how to start saving for your retirement. What I am gonna share with you is how to bridge this gap from your intentions to save and your actions.
There's sugar in a lot of foods where you don't expect it. Of course, there's lots of sugar in donuts or ice cream or pastries or other things that are sweet, candy, of course. But there are other places where you see it and you don't necessarily expect it. As an example, peanut butter. Here's a list of ingredients from Skippy peanut butter. And you see that sugar is the second most common ingredient. You may know from reading food labels that these ingredients in any food label are listed in order of how much there is in the food itself. So sugar comes right after peanuts. Here's another example. Beef stew. You wouldn't necessarily expect to find sugar in beef stew, but it's there. Now it's down the list of ingredients. It's actually toward the end. But if you look at the marketing of this and look at the can, it says there's fresh potatoes and carrots. But actually, there's more sugar in this than there is carrot.
Over the last decade, I've observed endangered species and habitats around the world using a photographic technique that captures the passage of time, literally from day to night, all within a single image. It has allowed me to witness the fleeting moments between wildlife and the natural habitat as time changes over the course of a single day. In the Serengeti, during a 5-week drought, I discovered a watering hole and watched for 26 hours diverse and competitive wildlife calmly share our planet's most precious resource, water. On Lake Bogoria in Kenya, I photographed the great migration of flamingos. This happens normally during the peak of dry season, but climate change has created evening thunderstorms, turning normally dry hills green and creating freshwater streams in which the flamingos joyously bathe. Our planet is changing before our eyes, but to witness that change is also to witness the remarkable relationships between all of nature, to see the infinite beauty of it, to learn how much bigger than us it is, and why it is worth fighting.